Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories.
I am 43, and I've always loved solitary hikes in the forest. The absence of city noise, the silence, the crackling of the fire, all of this helped me relax and recharge. I often went camping for a week, just to be alone with nature. This time, everything was as usual. I arrived at the familiar forest, chose a spot for my tent, and unpacked my things. I lit a fire, cooked some meat, brewed tea, and, when it started to get dark, I decided to take a walk nearby and collect some mushrooms. But something felt off. I couldn't explain the feeling, an almost imperceptible unease, as if something in the air wasn't right, unlike usual. The forest around me felt unnaturally quiet. Normally, at this time, I could hear an owl, the distant cry of a fox, or the crackling of branches from animals moving. But now it was oppressively silent. I took a few more steps, scanning the ground for mushrooms, when I heard a faint sound behind me. A rustle. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing. Just the twilight forest and the dark silhouettes of trees. Maybe a squirrel or a hare, I thought, but the sense of unease didn't fade. I decided to head back. As I walked back to camp, I noticed something strange. On the ground, near my tent, there were tracks. I knew for sure they hadn't been there when I first entered the forest. And what was worse, they were human tracks. But I was here alone. I slowly approached the tracks. They looked fresh, as if someone had been walking here very recently. I traced their direction with my eyes, they came from the depths of the forest. And stopped right by my tent. I broke into a cold sweat. I looked around, but saw no one. The trees stood motionless, silent witnesses to something I still couldn't understand. I woke up around 6:25, as the faint dawn light began to seep through the fabric of the tent. The night had been difficult, I couldn't find any peace because of the various sounds coming from the forest. Every now and then, I heard rustling, like someone walking quietly, and the cracking of branches, though I was sure it was just the forest coming alive at dawn. However, that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me, and I decided to go outside to clear my head a bit. I stepped out of the tent and stopped, looking at the tree standing directly opposite. At first, I didn't understand what had caught my attention, but when I looked closer, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. There were dark red marks on the tree bark that looked like fresh blood. I swallowed the stale air, trying not to believe my own eyes, but I couldn't think of what else it could be except blood. My hand started trembling, but I forced myself to take a step forward. With each movement, the silence became heavier, as if the forest was waiting for something. I noticed that the marks went down the trunk of the tree and then led into the forest, spilling onto the ground and continuing further. As I closed the distance to the marks, I felt more and more uneasy. With every step, the marks became more defined, and I could no longer stay calm. I gathered my strength and followed the path they led to. The forest around me was deafeningly quiet, and every twig snapping underfoot seemed thunderous in the oppressive silence. A few minutes later, I came upon a small, sloped clearing, and there, before me, appeared a tiny cabin that looked forgotten and abandoned. The windows were darkened, and the door seemed as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. The bloodstains led right up to the door. I stood frozen, trying to collect myself, but my legs wouldn't obey. I gathered the last of my strength and approached the door, opening it cautiously. Inside was darkness. Real silence. I made my way through the house, and then I saw more stains. They led to a room on the second floor. I couldn't leave this unexplained. When I climbed the stairs and opened the door, inside awaited a scene I could never have imagined. On the floor, by the bed, was a pool of fresh blood. All the items were overturned, as if from a violent shock. And amid this chaos, I saw something I could never forget: old, tattered clothes that belonged to someone I would probably meet someday. I was already ready to run out of the cabin when suddenly I felt a powerful blow to my head. It threw me into darkness, and everything around me began to blur. The pain in my head made it hard to keep my consciousness. What happened after that, I remember little. Only that my eyes opened, and I found myself tied to a tree, the cold air burning my skin. I tried to move, but my arms and legs were securely bound. The forest was silent, and only the sound of my breathing broke the stillness. I could hear someone's footsteps in the distance, but I couldn't gather myself to figure out who it was. I licked my dry lips, and my fingers brushed against something in my pocket. I pulled out a knife. It was sharp, and holding it in my hands, I felt a glimmer of hope. By tightening the ropes, I managed to tear one and free myself. I didn't have enough strength to stand, but I managed to get to my feet and start walking. My tent was only a few steps from where I was tied up. I was getting closer when I began to hear something else, this sound. Someone was quietly but persistently approaching. I couldn't afford to be seen. Slowing my pace, I found myself near my tent again, rushing inside. My heart was pounding in my chest as I gasped for air when I saw my gun lying next to my backpack. How could I have forgotten about it earlier? I grabbed the gun and felt the cold metal give me a sense of protection. Standing up, I took several deep breaths to calm myself. I held the gun in my hands, aimed at the tent door. I heard footsteps, someone was very close now. My legs started shaking, but I gathered all my resolve and stepped out of the tent. All the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, creating an atmosphere of relentless silence. I noticed silhouettes among the trees. As I approached one of them, I realized these figures weren't human. They moved oddly, mechanically, as if carrying some dark purpose. And then I saw something that made me freeze, another pool of blood on the ground leading to the very tree I had been tied to. My eyes fell on the face of one of them, it was familiar. I felt my blood run cold. This figure was one of those I had seen earlier in the cabin. Without waiting any longer, I rushed into the forest, but they were already behind me. I ran, not knowing where to, just as far away from them as possible. They didn't fall behind, and each step they took grew closer. I glanced over my shoulder, trying not to lose my direction. This wasn't just a chase, it was like a train closing in on its victim, and I had become that victim. My strength was fading, but I couldn't stop now. Suddenly, a small slope appeared before me, the line between the forest and the river. I hated myself for not choosing this path earlier, but now it was the only way out. I quickly hid behind some rocks by the shore and pulled my phone from my pocket, covered in blood and dirt. I quickly dialed the police, my voice barely audible through the shaking. I explained my situation in a hurry. Forest. Blood. People. They're chasing me. Hurry. After hearing their promise to send help immediately, I hastily took cover deeper behind the rocks, hoping it would slow them down. The wind was howling through the forest, like pressure building on me, and I could feel every sound that might be heard by every living creature around. Time seemed frozen, each second dragging on forever as I waited for help. Then, about half an hour later, the sounds began to approach. First, I heard sirens, then the low hum of many cars drawing near. My skin was cold with sweat, but I felt relief. When they arrived, the police came in full force, and several cars drowned out my fear. I sat on the ground, unable to believe my eyes, as the officers searched the area. They helped me to my feet. In my head, one question echoed: who was it? Who was really chasing me? The police searched the forest, found several unnatural tracks, and the same bloody marks leading to the cabin. However, no one was found. Only the darkened walls of that small cabin remained a mystery I couldn't unravel. When I was finally taken out of the forest, I felt like I had survived. But the feeling of being hunted still wouldn't leave me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I feel the cold of that blood, the sounds of the footsteps, and the shadow creeping closer. I'll never know who or what was really chasing me, but I know one thing for sure: this forest and those who live in it leave traces that can't be erased. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me and my friends, camping in the quiet woods far from civilization. We set up our tents near a peaceful creek, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The kind of place where you could almost forget the world. But something felt off the moment we arrived. A strange chill in the air, a stillness that didn't quite feel natural. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just nerves. After all, who wouldn't feel a little uneasy when surrounded by nothing but trees for miles? We spent the first evening around the campfire, joking and telling stories. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on our faces, and the night sky above us was dotted with stars. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, too peaceful. As the night wore on, a strange feeling of being watched crept over me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the darkness only stared back. I shook it off, assuming it was just the isolation getting to my head. But then I heard something. A twig snapping in the distance, followed by another, then a few more. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the footsteps grew closer. I looked to my friends. They didn't seem to notice anything, too caught up in their own conversations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to investigate, stepping away from the fire and into the shadows of the trees. I moved quietly, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. The forest was dark, but the moonlight filtered through the branches, offering just enough light to see. Then I saw it, a figure, standing motionless in the distance. It was too far away to make out any features, but it was unmistakable. A silhouette of a person, just standing there, staring at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if it was waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine and took a step back. But then, as if responding to my movement, the figure slowly began to approach. I turned and bolted back to camp, the sound of my breath ragged in my ears. I reached the fire and my friends, who hadn't noticed my absence, were still talking and laughing. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but they dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore the encounter, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. Later that night, I went to bed in my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle outside, every creak of the trees seemed amplified in the silence. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, coming from the darkness outside my tent. I froze. I couldn't make out the words, but it was as if someone was right there, just outside. My breath caught in my throat, and I held still, praying it would stop. The whispering grew louder, closer. I could feel it, the presence of something just beyond the fabric of my tent. I reached for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When I finally turned it on, the beam flickered and died. I heard the whisper again, this time followed by a soft knock on the side of the tent. I couldn't breathe. There was no way it could be one of my friends, they were all asleep, or so I thought. I grabbed my phone, my hands slick with sweat, and texted one of them, asking if they were outside. There was no reply. Suddenly, the tent flaps were tugged at, as if someone was trying to pull them open. I scrambled to get out, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I unzipped the door, there was nothing, just the empty, cold night. I ran back to the campfire, but my friends were gone. The fire had died down to a weak glow, and the campsite was eerily silent. I called out to them, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I searched the area, but there was no trace of them anywhere. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I searched through the night, calling their names, but I never found them. By morning, I was alone in the woods, terrified and confused. I never saw them again. The search parties came the next day, but they couldn't find a single sign of my friends. The woods swallowed them whole, and no one ever explained how or why. To this day, I don't go near those woods. Something was out there that night, something that took my friends and left me with nothing but an unanswered question. Who, or what, was in the forest with us that night, and why did it take them? Weeks passed, and the police investigation into the disappearance of my friends grew cold. They didn't find any evidence, not a single clue. The search party scoured the woods, but it was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the woods held secrets too dark to be uncovered. I tried to move on, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, my friends, laughing around the campfire, unaware of what was waiting for them. That whisper, that knock on the tent, it haunted me. I couldn't escape the sense that it wasn't over, that whatever had happened that night was still lurking, waiting for its next victim. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself driving back to the campsite. I don't know what drew me there, but I couldn't resist. I needed answers, or at least some closure. The woods were quieter than I remembered, the air thick with an unsettling silence. As I parked my car near the old trail, a cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper, so faint that I almost thought it was my imagination. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking towards the site. The familiar sense of dread washed over me, but this time I pushed through it. The campsite was exactly as it had been, but everything felt wrong. The trees seemed to loom taller, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to move in the corner of my vision. The creek, which once sounded peaceful, now gurgled ominously, like it was mocking me. I made my way to the spot where my tent had stood, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected the ground to be empty, but there, hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves, I found something. It was an old, weathered journal, stained with something dark. Was it blood? I couldn't tell. I opened it, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. The writing was erratic, scribbled in a hurried scrawl. One page caught my attention. They watch. They wait. They don't want us to leave. We're not alone. We never were. The words sent a chill through me. I recognized the handwriting. It was one of my friends. I looked around, suddenly aware of the silence. There were no birds, no animals. Just the creaking of the trees and the low murmur of the creek. I felt a presence, a weight on the air, as though the forest itself was watching me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the dry leaves. I spun around, expecting to see a search party or some other camper, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty woods. I turned back to the journal, trying to make sense of it, when I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was clearer, closer. You shouldn't have come back. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The voice came from behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. The air around me grew colder, and the trees seemed to press in, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. My breath caught in my throat as a shadow moved at the edge of the forest, a dark figure with no distinct features, just a silhouette. I bolted, running back to my car, but the figure followed me, its presence growing stronger with each step. I could hear its footsteps, but no matter how fast I ran, it was always right behind me, getting closer. I reached my car, fumbling for the keys, my hands slick with sweat. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut. My heart raced as I started the engine, but just before I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching me, its form now clearer than before. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong, twisted and jagged, like it had been pieced together from the shadows themselves. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the woods, but the image of that thing stayed with me. I could still feel its eyes on me, even as I drove further and further away. I haven't returned to that place, and I don't ever intend to. But I can't escape what I felt that night. Whatever is in those woods is still out there. And I know, deep down, that it wasn't just after my friends, it's after anyone who dares to enter. It watches, waits, and it never lets go. After that night, I thought I could leave the woods behind, but the memories wouldn't fade. I tried to go about my life, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the twisted figure in the trees. I heard its voice, that whisper, calling to me, reminding me of what I had seen and what I had narrowly escaped. Months passed, and I thought I was beginning to heal, until one night, the phone rang. It was a blocked number. Hesitant, I answered. "Is this the survivor?" a voice asked, distorted and rough, as if it had been dragged through the dirt itself. I froze. The voice was so familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Who is this?" I demanded, my heart pounding. I knew this wasn't just a prank call, not with the way my blood ran cold. "It's not over," the voice said, its tone a mix of dread and warning. "They're still out there. It's still waiting." I hung up, but the words echoed in my mind. The line had gone dead, but something told me it wasn't finished. The next few days were a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, wondering if that thing was following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with me yet, that whatever it was, it had marked me, and it wasn't going to let go so easily. Then came the letter. It arrived without any return address, just a plain envelope with a single sheet of paper inside. As I unfolded it, my hands trembled. "The forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive." The words were written in an all too familiar handwriting. My friend's handwriting. The one who had disappeared. My throat went dry as I read the rest. "We didn't leave. We were never meant to. They found us. We are part of the forest now, like the trees, the shadows. You can't escape. You'll come back, just like we did." My vision blurred as panic set in. This couldn't be happening. I'd left, I'd survived, but it wasn't over. They hadn't let me go. The woods had taken them, and now, it was coming for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sounds of footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. I checked the locks, but there was nothing to see when I looked outside, nothing but the deep, impenetrable darkness of the woods that seemed to stretch on forever. Around 3 a.m., the knocking started. Soft at first, like a tap, but then it grew louder, insistent. Knock. 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 I knew it wasn't a person. I knew it was them. The figures from that night in the woods were back. They had found me. I crept toward the window, my breath shallow, my hands shaking as I peered outside. There, in the darkness, I saw something, two glowing eyes. Not human, not animal. Just watching. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, panic rising in my chest. It was too late to run. I had nowhere to go. The knocking continued, but this time, it was louder, closer. It was like the very walls of my house were pulsing, vibrating with the pressure of whatever was out there. I tried to call the police, but my phone was dead, the battery drained in an instant. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the room plunged into cold darkness. A cold I had never felt before. It was as if the warmth of life itself was being sucked out of the room. I could barely make out the shape in front of me, but I knew it wasn't human. It was wrong, twisted, like it was made from the shadows themselves. And then, I heard the voice again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, distorted, full of rage and pain. "You were never meant to leave. You will never leave." Before I could react, the room filled with a cacophony of screams, my friends' voices, distorted and tangled, crying out from the depths of the woods. The walls around me seemed to breathe, the house groaning under the weight of the forest pressing in. The last thing I remember was the figure lunging toward me, its eyes burning with a fiery, inhuman glow. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the darkness as I felt myself being pulled into the cold embrace of the forest once more. The next thing I knew, I was no longer in my home. The cold ground beneath me felt like wet earth, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I couldn't see, but I could hear the trees groaning around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. It felt as if the forest had swallowed me whole, pulling me back into its dark embrace. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, as if something had tied me down. The world around me shifted, one moment it was pitch black, the next flashes of distorted images flickered in and out of focus. I could hear whispers, low and guttural, coming from all directions. The whispers weren't in any language I recognized, but they were unmistakably familiar. They sounded like my friends. Suddenly, a figure appeared before me, its form jagged and shifting like a shadow caught in the wind. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes, if you could call them eyes, piercing me. The voice echoed inside my mind, calm but chilling. You're one of us now. The forest will never let you go. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body froze, and all I could do was watch as the figure moved closer, the darkness deepening around us. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted forms bending toward me as if they were waiting for something. A surge of panic coursed through me, and I fought with everything I had to break free. But it was no use. The forest had claimed me, just as it had claimed them. It was pulling me under, drowning me in its suffocating grasp. And then, just when I thought I was lost forever, the figure spoke again, this time with a voice full of twisted, malicious glee. Welcome to the forest. Welcome home. The last thing I felt was the earth beneath me pulling tighter, the cold consuming me, as the world faded into a void where nothing remained, except the whispers.